Hello, Auburn Presbyterian Church and the greater community. This is Zach Hymack from Eckhart Public Library, and today we're doing a program on the Auburn Presbyterian Church history. A few years ago, Sharon Zonker from the Methodist Church approached us about digitizing some of their old records. Both the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church have histories going back over 175 years in the community. At the same time, we approached Nancy Darrow at the Presbyterian Church about digitizing some of those records as well. As a part of that, we ended up digitizing over 800 original pictures, artifacts, records, some going back even earlier than 1890. And we wanted to promote that project and just be able to connect some of the church's histories with the artifacts that we found. So that's what this project is. We were able to get a grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services through the State Library to do that digitization to preserve those records for the future. Our goal is to kind of be able to open up primary resources that shed light on the history of these two churches and show just how deep these churches' roots grow into the fabric of our community. So all these materials will be available for viewing at the Genealogy Center and on the Eckhart Public Library online photo archive. And before we start, just one more note, this isn't really original research. This is just drawn from the church's records themselves, which are also available to see at the Genealogy Center. So without further ado, this is how deep do these roots grow, Auburn's earliest churches and their impact. So apparently Horace Walpole to Parliament was laying the American Revolution at the feet of the Presbyterians. In 1776, there were approximately 2.5 million people in colonial America. The church records say that 2/3 of them were Scotch or Scotch-Irish trained in Knox Calvinism, which is the theological bent that Presbyterianism derives from. 50 years later, in 1826, there were about 12 resident Presbyterian ministers and 19 congregations, mostly along the Ohio River. Side note, one of those churches is St. John Presbyterian Church in New Albany, and they were founded in 1816 and operated one of the southern stops of the Underground Railroad across the river from Louisville. An early Presbyterian text called Indiana a jewel on the frontier, possessing a degree of beauty equaled only by the amazing fertility of its soil, a soil unmoistened by the sweat or tears or blood of the slave. In 1838, there's a denominational split in American Presbyterianism. The old siders demanded that the new siders be censored for their abolitionist sympathies, and this occurred during a time of national vitality among American Christians when evangelism and missionary work were expanding at a fevered pace across denominations. So then we come to Auburn. The Auburn Courier newspaper from 1912 said, "When the town was in its primeval state, the houses few and far between, and the population a proverbial handful, the religious spirit prevailed to a decided degree." Apparently journalism was a little more poetic back then. So there's a picture of the old elm, which was near where Genealogy is now. So Auburn's founded in 1836 by Wesley Park. The Methodist Church is founded in 1839 by Reverend Samuel Reed and Wesley Park. There's approximately 72 residents in Auburn, most suffering from mosquito fever on account of the swamps outside of town. And the Presbyterians wanted a organization of their own. Apparently the frontier people were craving religion of any kind. And these are all some pictures here of DeKalb County, cabins in the early farmland. So this is a picture of the original courthouse in DeKalb County. This is where every congregation met separately, but in the same location. But on December 6, 1844, 8 members met in the courthouse to declare their desire to be Presbyterian. Reverend Jt Bliss was their first pastor. Some of the comments of the time said that he was one of the first trustees of the city of Auburn, and he and his wife encouraged women to take an active leadership role. So things move pretty fast from the church's founding. In 1845, the Ladies' Aid Society is organized, and that will be a pretty major influence over the next 100 years. Sam Ralston donates a lot where Brown & Brown Insurance is now, and that's where the first Presbyterian church is built in 1850. So up on the upper left, you see some of the original church records of financial records, and then the original church building. So this here is the constitution of the Auburn Female Benevolent Society. This is in 1856. And it says, a few of the ladies of the Auburn Presbyterian Church and congregation, being desirous of doing something in the cause of benevolence, met at the house of their pastor, Reverend Jt Bliss, and organized themselves into a society by adopting the following constitution and bylaws. So this is the first organization of its kind in Auburn. It's non-denominational and interreligious, and by this time, the church has 43 members. The mid-1800s, obviously a distinctive time in American history. Reverend Edward Wright was the pastor then and had some comprehensive ability as an educator and kind of created a revolution in DeKalb schools. Quote, brought order and system out of confusion and chaos, held examinations for students, and created and fostered an educational interest whose effects have proved substantial and far-reaching. And there's a picture of the original Riley School, probably a little later than 1860. Obviously, mid-century was a distinctive time in American history for other reasons. Apparently, Lincoln was very popular in DeKalb County. There were so many volunteers that there wasn't a draft for the Civil War until 1863. Charles Munn from the Presbyterian Church was the chaplain to the 100th Indiana Volunteer Infantry from Auburn. There's a picture right in the middle of them. And Reverend Lynch and Reverend Wright zealously and eloquently championed the Union and freedom, and the greater portion of church people were in hearty and active sympathy with them. During this time, S.B. Ward also conducts a series of night meetings, a bit of a non-denominational revival in Auburn. Now, apparently around this time, a lot is purchased at the cost of $400 by some ladies of the society. So this is where you get the first church building on the current location, which at that date was the finest, costliest, most complete in all its appointments in all the county. It was built for a cost of $6,000. Gas was used for the lighting. There's seating for 500, and it was followed by Reverend Johnson with a series of meetings. Much to the gratification of his many Auburn friends, his ministry has been marked by uniform and brilliant success. And by this point, the church has 115 members. If you've been to the Presbyterian Church, you might have seen the quilt that was made in 1890 by the Ladies' Aid Society, and it raised money to help purchase the manse lot. It's also worth noting that the Auburn Courier pointed out around this time that separate and distinct in name, but united in purpose, the Presbyterian Church of Auburn has ever cooperated with the churches of the town in advancing morality and religion, and their history is one which its faithful members may well reflect with pride and pleasure. At the 50th anniversary, Mary Teeters, J.A. Barnes, and Mary Nussbaum all spoke about their organizations. A lot of mission focus. You can see J.A. Barnes' name there at the bottom of the Missionary Society record. So here's just some of the biased inclusions of the library. We've got the cornerstone laying in 1910 at the turn of the century. If you look really close, you can see some people sitting on the manse roof line, getting in the cheap seats. Reverend Brand was also greatly beloved by the people with whom he had charge and had been very successful. So again, the church growing at the turn of the century is 143 members in 1910, 191 by 1915. And in 1923, a fire destroys most of the church records from 1856 to 1877. So we don't have a lot of records from around that time, but that's part of the reason for doing this project. Lots of mission increase around the 30s. The Boy Scouts, the Ladies' Aid Society, again, still going strong. The church is promoting family activities, monthly socials. In 1936, there's a major remodel of the church. The chancel is divided, $20,000 are raised, and the architect who did it is actually the same person who built the library. By 1941, there's 300 church members. So in 1944, the church reaches its 100th anniversary, and this is just something that Reverend Craven says. 100 years has been the story of Presbyterianism in the Middle West, from circuit rider to modern pulpit. This has been a century of faith in God and of man's innate desire to approach him, never believing that right makes right, but that true communion embraces doctrine, stewardship, and worship. We face the future with the same prayers and faiths of our fathers. So during this period of time, it said that these were years of danger and great faith and confidence. It was a heroic period, an earnest and courageous time in our church. So this is obviously during the World War II and the post-war period. The religious education program is instituted, where students are released for an hour in a week from school to have religious education. The women of the church vote to hold a whole association of their disparate groups. And one of the interesting records of the church say, women have always shared in the work of our church. No matter under what name they worked, the aims and the objects have been much the same. So in 1955, the educational wing is built. The men's fellowship is meeting and has 40 to 50 men in attendance, with lively discussions often turning to the lesson's relationship with contemporary problems. They did a lot of the semi-skilled labor in the education wing construction. Scouting program surges. Women serve dinners several times a week to local service groups, raising money for equipment and providing congregational dinners. In 1960, there's a facelift and redecoration, which put on the current limestone and what it looks like now. And mission continues to advance throughout the 60s. The community nursery school begins in 1966. They get a grant and equipment, and it becomes the children's first center that we know now. In 1967, the Presbyterian Daycare Center opens, which is also Auburn's first. And Marie Klink, who's one of the daycare cooks, investigates how to help senior citizens in the area, which leads to the founding of the DeKalb County Council on Aging. By 1967, Auburn Presbyterian is the 9th largest church in the presbytery. As a final note, it was with faith in the future that drove our forefathers to build the church. This small church was a means of well-being. Members retired home with confidence that God would grant them wisdom and strength. We are reminded that the men and women who built these buildings, treasured and used them, live with a future just as uncertain as our own. Nevertheless, these men and women did their work well, with courage and even occasionally with greatness. They passed a strong faith to the next generation. So that concludes our program for the LSTA project. We'll also leave a link in the description about how to view all these artifacts on the online photo archive. And then below there's the citations about the books. And then obviously credit goes to Chelsea Dant, Thomas Irwin, Melissa Reno, Sarah Adams, Katie Knutson, Matt Johnson, Alan Sweeney, and Jenny Kobiel-Amandor, who really did a lot of the legwork for this project. And special thanks to Nancy Darrow, who helped give us the access to these materials. So thank you very much. Come by to see us at the Genealogy Center for any of this information, and if you're curious about how deep these roots grow.